us again. This is Pastor Ron and Pastor Ethan, and coming back to you for another day, another little short testimony time. And wanted to share with you today something that started sharing last Wednesday night. So we're going to back up and recap a little bit of what you would have heard last Wednesday night if you were here with us. But we're looking at talking about the topic of God's will. And in that, we're looking at, we started off by looking at the whole idea of defining what God's will is.
So sometimes it's hard, and oftentimes as Christians we want to know God's will. We want to know what God has for us. But why is it oftentimes so hard to determine God's will in our decisions? Why can't we tell if we've found God's will in our decisions? Sometimes we kind of joke, and you think about ancient Greek mythology and how they spoke with the gods and all these different things, and sometimes we kind of wish that God would just, the lightning bolt or just the audible voice. Why can't God speak to us in that way? Because and maybe sometimes we even fool ourselves into thinking that, if God spoke to me audibly, then I would actually do what He told me to do. Why doesn't God work that way sometimes?
Well, Ethan, I just happen to have a passage from God's Word here that
I happen to be in Judges 6 myself. So amazing.
So anyway, if you have your Bibles open to Judges chapter 6, or I'll give you a couple of seconds to get open to Judges chapter 6, we're going to read a passage in there where Gideon actually himself questions God's will. And what we want to look at today is God's response to Gideon as Gideon questions God's will. As we look at this whole topic of questioning God's will, sometimes we feel like it's not right for me to question, but I don't think God comes down with judgment against Gideon. Instead, I believe God answers Gideon, and He wants Gideon to know what his will is. So as we look at this, I think it's important for us to understand that as humans, sometimes we do question God's will. Judges chapter 6, verse 14 and 16. And the Lord looked upon him and said, Go in this thy might, and thou shalt save Israel from the hand of the Midianites. Have not I sent thee? And he said unto him, O my Lord, wherewithal shall I save Israel? Behold, my family is poor in Manasseh, and I am the least in my father's house. And the Lord said unto him, Surely I will be with thee, and thou shalt smite the Midianites as one man. God gives Gideon the call, and Gideon immediately questions God. But God is faithful to Gideon, and God gives him the answer. And then we find as Gideon moves forward, we find that Gideon isn't finished with his questions of God, or he isn't finished with his questioning of God's will. You go down to verse 36, and it says, And Gideon said unto God, If thou wilt save Israel by my hand, as thou hast said, behold, I will put a fleece of wool in the floor, and if the dew be on the fleece, and it be dry upon all the earth beside, then shall I know that thou wilt save Israel by mine hand, as thou hast said. And it was so, for he arose up early on the morrow, and thrust the fleece together, and wringed out the dew, the dew out of the fleece, a full bowl of water. And Gideon said unto God, Let not thine anger be hot against me, and I will speak but this once. Let me prove, I pray thee, but this once with the fleece. Let it now be dry only upon the fleece, and upon all the ground let there be dew. And God did so that night. For it was dry upon the fleece only, and there was dew on all of the ground. I believe that what you see happening here is you see Gideon questioning God again. Not only does he question him the first time there in verse 15 and 16, but he also questions him again later on. And then when God gives him the answer every time, he says, But let me ask you one more time. And every time God answers Gideon.
I think it's important to note here that even though Gideon questions God, it's important to know the distinction between questioning God and losing trust or losing faith in what God is doing. And that's not what Gideon's doing here. Gideon's not he's not lost hope and faith in the fact that God is going to deliver, but it's just questioning God. What are you doing? But the important thing there is that distinction between questioning and not allowing that questioning to lead to unbelief, or not allowing that questioning to lead to a loss or a lack of trust, a lack of faith. So that's, I think, an important distinction, because the question was asked, and Gideon asked that question, but the important thing to realize is that God didn't forsake Gideon because he asked the question, but God instead, he still answered, and he still showed Gideon what he wanted him to do,
right,
and made that available to him in the following verses.
Yeah. Very good. But it's also important to see that it went on beyond that. God, in Gideon's questions, God comes back to Gideon now. And as you begin to read and understand more of the story, now God begins to put Gideon's faith to the test. So, God not only would allow Gideon to ask those questions, but he also tests Gideon's tests Gideon's faith to follow God's will.
So later on in chapter 7, then, when it sees God dwindling the army that he's given to Gideon. He starts off with 32,000 men, and through different processes, he whittles it down to less than 1% of what he originally came with. And it's interesting how, again, he questioned God, but it wasn't a fact of losing trust in what God was doing, because God showed that he was still faithful. Because then he went with 300 men, and they got the job done. They did what God had called them to do. And just the fact that God used and did it the way he did was, we would see as unconventional as, I'm going to dwindle 32,000 down to 300 men. That seems crazy, but we see that God still was faithful, and God still provided, and he still even allowed things to happen that Gideon's army was even able to still come out victorious.
Yeah, and it's amazing, because as you look at this, what you see though is you see God taking Gideon and bringing Gideon into his will, bringing Gideon's will into God's will. And as we look at God's will for our lives, I think it's important for us to see that that's how God does that work. God takes what we bring to the table, and he uses what we bring to the table inside of his will. It's an amazing thing to see how God works. So we're going to take up with this again tomorrow. So I want to encourage you to come back and be with us tomorrow. And we'll take up more on this whole topic, this idea of God's will. Thank you for being here.
Yep, we'll see you.